The Rambo knife didn't just appear on the screen, it exploded into culture. What was supposed to be just a movie prop quickly became a symbol of survival, toughness, and independence. Fans didn't see it as a simple tool, they treated it like a talisman, something that carried the promise of being ready for anything. Every little feature, the hollow handle, the serrated spine, the tiny compass, was shown as if it was absolutely essential for survival in the harshest conditions. Hollywood reinforced this dream, showing Rambo cutting, fighting, and surviving in ways that made the knife seem almost magical. But the truth is, people weren't just buying a blade, they were buying a story, a promise of invincibility. Collectors and survival enthusiasts elevated the knife into something sacred. It appeared on magazine covers, in survival manuals, and even in fan clubs that celebrated its supposed power. The myth spread so fast that nobody stopped to ask the big question, could it actually deliver? Instead, people wanted to believe. They invested emotionally, treating it like more than steel and plastic. This is where tension starts to build, because the knife's reputation was far bigger than its real capabilities. And by making it a legendary object, Hollywood set the stage for one of the greatest reveals in knife history. Was the Rambo knife truly unstoppable, or was it just clever storytelling? The psychology behind the hype is fascinating. Humans are naturally drawn to heroes, to objects that promise control, safety, and strength. The Rambo knife was marketed almost like a magical weapon, and audiences bought in completely. They didn't just want to see Rambo survive, they wanted to believe they could survive too, simply by owning the same knife. That emotional attachment was powerful, but it also created a trap. Because sooner or later, the difference between cinematic fantasy and real survival would be revealed. And when that moment came, it wasn't just about a blade, it was about shattering an illusion millions of people had invested in. Jimmy Lyle, the craftsman behind the original design, knew this tension better than anyone. His job was to make a practical, durable knife, but the market wanted Hollywood fantasy. Oversized blades, hollow handles, flashy features, things that looked good on screen but could compromise real-world performance. Lyle struck a delicate balance, but as soon as the design was copied and mass-produced, things got messy. Imitation knives exploded across the market, promising the same power but with lower quality. Suddenly, the very object that symbolized toughness was being sold in cheap versions that broke under pressure. And yet, the craze only grew stronger. The 1980s survivalist movement gave the Rambo knife even more fuel. With Cold War fears, wilderness survival shows, and a culture obsessed with being self-reliant, the knife became more than merchandise, it was an icon of masculinity and preparedness. Every image reinforced the fantasy, a lone warrior conquering the wilderness, armed with nothing but a survival knife. Demand skyrocketed. But here's the twist, most people weren't buying a functional tool. They were buying a dream. Lyle's originals were works of craftsmanship, but the public clutched at flashy imitations that looked impressive but failed in practice. This set the stage for the truth bomb about to hit. And that truth revolved around the hollow handle, the so-called survival feature. On paper, it sounded brilliant. Store your fishing line, your matches, your hooks inside the handle. In reality, it was the knife's greatest weakness. Instead of being one solid piece of steel, the blade and the handle were separate. Under stress, that weak joint could fail catastrophically. Picture this, you're deep in the woods, depending on your knife for survival, and the handle snaps like a toy. It's like swinging a hammer with a loose head, you don't trust it anymore. And once people realized this, admiration turned into shock. Tests confirmed the problem. Survivalists pushed these knives to the limit, chopping wood, prying, twisting, and discovered how easily they could break. Imagine the disappointment, the very tool that was supposed to save you could actually betray you. These weren't abstract risks, they were real failures in real situations. And with each broken handle, the legend crumbled a little more. Viewers at this point feel the emotional punch, not just learning the fact, but feeling the betrayal. How could something so iconic, so worshipped, have such a fatal flaw? But here's where it gets even deeper. The hollow handle wasn't just a flaw in design, it was a lesson in critical thinking. It showed the danger of choosing appearance over reliability, of falling in love with myth instead of truth. This is where the story hits its dramatic climax. Because the audience has been taken on a journey, from idolizing the knife to realizing the uncomfortable reality. The Rambo knife was powerful in culture, but fragile in reality. And yet, this failure wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a transformation that would change the entire knife industry. By exposing the flaw, the Rambo knife forced knife makers and survivalists to focus on what really mattered. Suddenly, full-tang construction, the design where blade and handle are one solid piece of steel, became the gold standard. People realized that survival wasn't about flashy features, it was about strength and reliability. In a strange twist, the very knife that failed became a teacher. It educated an entire generation of enthusiasts, turning disappointment into wisdom. And without meaning to, the Rambo knife raised the standards of what survival knives should be. Collectors and knife historians now see Jimmy Lyle's originals as masterpieces. Not because they were flawless, but because they captured a moment in culture. Meanwhile, survival instructors and military professionals pointed to full-tang knives as the real tools worth trusting. The myth of the Rambo knife became a case study, a way to teach people that looks can be deceiving, and that in survival, engineering always beats fantasy. It was no longer just about steel and edges, it became about psychology, culture, and the human tendency to believe in myths. Comparisons drove the point home. Knives like the K-bar or the ESEE didn't have the Hollywood glamour, but they had toughness, reliability, and battlefield history. They didn't break under pressure. Enthusiasts looked back and realized, the K-bar could outlast almost anything, but it lacked the cinematic glow. The Rambo knife, on the other hand, had glow without substance. That contrast is powerful, because it shows us how easily storytelling can overpower practicality, and why the myth became bigger than the knife itself. In the end, the Rambo knife is a paradox. It failed, yet it succeeded. It disappointed, yet it educated. It was flawed, but its flaws forced an industry to evolve. What began as a Hollywood lie turned into a catalyst for real improvement. The knife taught survivalists and collectors a lesson that still matters today: don't fall for the myth, look for the truth. And that truth is still shaping knives, culture, and survival training decades later. Even today, its legacy is alive. The Cold War era made it a symbol of fear and hope. People built bunkers, stockpiled supplies, and dreamed of being ready for anything, with a Rambo knife by their side. That symbol still fascinates us, because it connects history, psychology, and pop culture. But when survivalists actually put these knives to the test, the flaws became clear. Stories of handles snapping or tools failing turned the myth into a cautionary tale. And that's where the lesson lies: a survival tool must be reliable, not just impressive. The Rambo knife didn't just stay on the big screen, it spilled into everyday life. Suddenly, stores were selling replicas in blister packs, swap meets had cheap knockoffs with hollow handles, and even toy versions appeared for kids. Newspapers reported on the knife craze, and some schools and towns started banning them altogether. The idea that a single blade could transform an ordinary person into a survivor or hero became contagious. People were drawn not only to the knife but to the fantasy it represented, that they could be self-reliant, powerful, and ready for anything, even if they never set foot outside their neighborhood. The Rambo knife had crossed from Hollywood fiction into real suburban garages, tucked away in drawers, or displayed like trophies. The craze wasn't about practicality, it was about identity. And that identity made thousands believe they had survival in their pocket, when in truth, they only carried an illusion. For real soldiers, though, the story was different. Veterans who had served in Vietnam, Iraq, and other conflicts often chuckled at the Hollywood knife. They knew the reality of combat and survival didn't rely on hollow-handled blades with compasses. Most soldiers trusted simpler, battle-tested tools like the K-bar or bayonet, which were reliable and could take real punishment. When asked about the Rambo knife, many military men called it a movie prop, nothing more. Some admitted it looked intimidating, but intimidation means little when a blade breaks under pressure. Their reaction highlighted a sharp contrast: civilians saw magic, soldiers saw marketing. And this disconnect became one of the biggest myths perpetuated by the film industry. Real warriors trusted what worked. The Rambo knife? It looked good on screen, but on the battlefield, it was a liability waiting to happen. And that truth spread slowly, but it spread. Hollywood sells fantasy, but bushcraft demands reality. Imagine trying to build a shelter with a flashy hollow-handled blade. One strike against hard wood and the knife could snap. In contrast, real survivalists reach for sturdy full-tang knives that can chop, carve, and pry without fear of breaking. The Rambo knife was never designed for making fire, skinning game, or preparing food in the wild. It was designed to look menacing on film. Survival experts know tools must serve multiple purposes, and the fantasy knife didn't deliver. Out in the wilderness, glamour doesn't save lives, grit and functionality do. This is where the myth crumbled the hardest, in actual survival scenarios. Fans who tried to live like Rambo quickly discovered that real survival isn't cinematic, it's dirty, tough, and unforgiving. And in that environment, a blade built for looks becomes dangerous, not protective. That's why bushcrafters still laugh at Hollywood steel. The hollow handle was both genius and fatal flaw. On paper, it sounded incredible, a mini survival kit inside your blade. Matches, fishing line, needles, all tucked neatly where you carried your grip. But physics told another story. By hollowing out the handle, designers weakened the very point of strength. The tang, which should have run the full length of the knife for stability, was replaced by a thin tube of metal. Under stress, chopping, prying, or striking, the knife risked snapping clean off at the hilt. Countless survivalists who bought cheap replicas learned this the hard way, their blades failing when they needed them most. Yet the design was irresistible for marketing, because it promised everything in one package: weapon, shelter builder, fire starter. The flaw was hidden beneath the surface, invisible to buyers dazzled by Hollywood glow. And that invisible weakness became the symbol of how fantasy collapses under the weight of reality. The marketing behind the Rambo knife was nothing short of genius, or deception, depending on who you ask. Companies knew they could tap into the emotions of fear and masculinity. Ads showed men gripping these knives like warriors, ready for the apocalypse. Replica makers sold millions worldwide, turning what started as a movie prop into a billion-dollar industry. Was it survival gear, or was it snake oil? Buyers weren't just purchasing steel, they were buying confidence, a ticket to a fantasy where they could be heroes. This is the genius of marketing, selling not the product itself but the story around it. Yet, for every collector who proudly displayed their blade, there were just as many disappointed owners who realized the knife couldn't deliver what the packaging promised. Survival wasn't found in a hollow handle, and those who believed otherwise discovered they'd paid more for an illusion than a solution. Knives have always carried legacy, and the Rambo knife was only one chapter in a much larger book. Before Stallone wielded his iconic blade, the Bowie knife dominated 19th-century America as a symbol of frontier survival. Later, the K-bar became synonymous with Marines storming beaches in World War II. Each era forged its tool, blending practicality with identity. Then came Rambo, and suddenly knives weren't just tools, they were stars. From there, the evolution pushed forward: survival blades with stronger steels, ergonomic handles, and full-tang construction replaced flashy gimmicks. Today, bushcrafters and military personnel trust designs refined by decades of trial and error. The Rambo knife sits in this timeline like an odd relic, legendary, yes, but flawed compared to its ancestors and descendants. Its place is secure, but not because it was the strongest. It's remembered because it was the loudest, echoing across a culture more than across real battlefields. The knife also carved its mark into pop culture far beyond survivalists. It showed up in comics, video games, action figures, and parodies. From arcade machines in the 80s to video games like Call of Duty decades later, the silhouette of that oversized blade became instantly recognizable. Kids wore plastic replicas strapped to their belts, cartoons spoofed it, and even comedians used it as shorthand for macho bravado. Few weapons in history have become so iconic outside their original purpose. This legacy wasn't built on performance but on recognition. The Rambo knife turned into a logo, a cultural shorthand for toughness, rebellion, and cinematic fantasy. And because it was everywhere, it stuck in collective memory long after its practical flaws were exposed. In the end, its biggest survival wasn't in the wilderness, it was in our imagination, where legends outlive facts. So, what does real survival demand? Not a movie prop, but a reliable set of tools. A sturdy full-tang knife. A fire starter that works in wet conditions. A multi-tool that can fix, cut, and grip. A simple flashlight that won't fail when the sun goes down. These are the quiet, unglamorous heroes of survival. They don't shine with Hollywood drama, but they deliver when lives are on the line. The Rambo knife promised everything but delivered little. Real survival gear doesn't promise, it performs. And that is the final lesson hidden behind all the smoke and action. True preparation doesn't look epic on screen, but it keeps you alive off-screen. The contrast is sharp, fantasy may inspire, but reality saves. And if you're choosing what to trust in an emergency, would you rather carry an illusion, or the real tools that never fail? So, here's the final question for you: if your life depended on it, would you choose a knife that looks like a Hollywood dream, or one that's been proven to survive the worst? The story of the Rambo knife is unforgettable because it forces us to face that choice. It entertains, it teaches, and it warns us not to trust appearances. The knife may have been flawed, but its impact is legendary. And in the end, that's why the Rambo knife will always remain a powerful story, part myth, part truth, and an eternal lesson in survival.